Okay, well, it is 3:30, so we're going to get started. Welcome. Today is the fourth webinar in the CDTC New Visions virtual learning series. And today we're going to talk about and really take a deeper dive into freight and what the New Visions 2050 plan says about freight, about trends and growth in e-commerce, and how that is affecting our transportation system and what we can do to mitigate any impacts on our communities. So if you are AICP and looking to get credit, you can get 1 CM credit for attending today's webinar. So before we get started, if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, I encourage you to use the chat box or the Q&A function, and we will check back and answer those questions at the end of today's presentation. We're going to begin with an introduction and overview of the New Visions 2050 plan, and then we'll have Chrisbauer from the CDTC staff talk about CDTC's freight planning initiatives. And then today we also have Jerry Bogatz from the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, and he's going to talk about e-commerce trends and lessons learned from the New York metro area and how they are working with their freight partners and stakeholders there. And then we'll wrap up with a brief discussion and answer any questions. We also have some live polls today, so you can either use your phone to text your answers, or you can open a new browser window and do it there. So to join the poll, like I said, you can open a new browser window and go to pollev.com and enter CDTC NV 2050. Or if you're using a smartphone or any other kind of cell phone, you can text, the number is 22333, and that it says code, it should say CDTC NV 2050. So to kick off, we're just going to start with a brief poll, and if you could text what type of organization you represent. You can text, or you can do this in a browser window. We'll give the poll a couple minutes to get everyone's responses. Okay, so it looks like we have a mix of people from the public sector, from state government, and from local government. And if you weren't able to respond to the poll, don't worry. You can, if you really want to participate and you're not able to do it, you can always put your answer in the chat box. So what is New Visions 2050? The New Visions 2050 is the regional transportation plan for the Capital District. It's basically a blueprint for regional transportation that reflects a shared vision for the future. It's a 30-year plan, and it guides the prioritization and funding of investment decisions. It was developed collaboratively with transportation providers, local governments, state agencies, private sector, stakeholders, and also the public. The Capital District Transportation Committee, or CDTC, is a metropolitan planning organization, or an MPO. And we are a place that we are a transportation policymaking and planning organization that allocates federal funding for transportation. We include the 4 counties of Albany, Rensselaer, Schenectady, and most of Saratoga County, minus the town of Moreau and South Glens Falls. We also include the State Department of Transportation, Capital District Regional Planning Commission, the airport, Port of Albany, Thruway, and of course CDTA. Representatives from all 4 counties are on the CDTC Planning Committee, as well as our cities and several of our towns. So this is part of the New Visions virtual learning series is part of our implementation phase of New Visions. If you, your community would like a virtual training for your town board, city council, zoning, or planning board, we'd be happy to set something up and work with you. Or if you would like to set up a virtual presentation or training for a different board or community organization, please reach out. There is a form that you can fill out at cdtcmpo.org/NV2050. And that is where you can find all information on New Visions. The next webinar in this series is scheduled for January 19th, and it will be on mobility. We'll be talking about everything except driving alone. So it will be an interesting webinar. So what's in the New Visions 2050 plan? There are several components. The executive summary is on our website. We encourage you to take a look. It really summarizes the main points of the plan, the principles, and our major policy recommendations. There's also a system performance report, a public participation plan. There are 11 technical area papers, including freight, and these really go into the details and progress on different programs at CDTC and data about different modes and services and what's going on in the transportation system. There's also a financial plan and, of course, a glossary. So transportation money, federal transportation money can be used to address a variety of needs. And CDTC looks at the transportation system and approaches planning from a holistic standpoint, recognizing transportation affects everyone. We all need a reliable bridge and road system where we can drive on, where goods can be delivered, we can take the bus and ride on. We need more sidewalks, trails, bike lanes, and other transportation services to connect us with people, opportunities, and services that we rely on a day-to-day basis. So New Visions 2050 lays out principles for continuing to develop and invest in a multimodal system that acknowledges the interconnectedness of these modes and places in our region. So the purpose of today's webinar is to take a deeper dive on freight and provide you with tools and resources so you can play a role in implementing the principles and policy recommendations in New Visions. And the New Visions planning and investment principles are the centerpiece of the plan. They're directly related to the criteria that we use to evaluate proposed projects and to prioritize them for federal funding. They were developed and proposed over time by New Visions task forces, and they influence the types of tasks and initiatives that CDTC initiates and supports, like our local road safety plan, the Capital District Trails plan, security planning, our freight plan, etc. So there's 15 New Visions planning and investment principles. And today we're really going to focus on this moving freight efficiently principle. Just a quick snapshot of the region. You're all familiar with the region and its unique nature, having being multinodal, having multiple cities and multiple suburban cores built up around them. But this just kind of gives us an idea of what has been going on. It's a slow growth region. There hasn't been a significant amount of population growth. However, we do continue to see development. This has led to an increase in driving. We have a changing population, and changing lifestyles and trends indicate changing needs, and the system needs to adapt to those needs as our people in our region change, as technology changes and everything else. The road and bridge network has a replacement value exceeding $30 billion. And of course, we all rely on this network, and preserving it is one of our highest priorities. As you can see, we have developed an extensive infrastructure network that moves a significant amount of people and goods on a daily basis. So some of the major policy recommendations in New Visions, of course, is maintaining a state of good repair, again, focusing on preserving that road and the bridge and highway system. Congestion management, not adding new capacity, but managing what we have. Implementing complete streets and accommodating all modes for all users. Transit-oriented development or smart growth. Supporting access management. Also safe systems or Vision Zero, meaning that no death on the transportation system is acceptable. Americans with Disability Act compliance, and of course, expanding public participation and really connecting and engaging with the public regularly. Some previous long-range plan accomplishments include the region's bus rapid transit system, which we recently saw a new BRT service launched in our river corridor. The Albany County Rail Trail, the I-787 Hudson River Corridor Study, the Couse Corners Roundabout, I-87 Exit 3 Airport Connector, the Zim Smith Trail, Rexford Bridge, Madison Avenue Road Diet, paving of the Northway, Erie Boulevard reconstruction, and a number of other projects. These have all been identified in previous New Visions plans and have been implemented. So programming federal transportation funds and making sure that we are maintaining our system while also enhancing it and providing options and opportunity to everyone involves constructing, maintaining, and operating the public transit systems, intermodal facilities, a bicycle and pedestrian network, and a street highway system. It costs an average of $775 million each year between now and 2050 to maintain what we invest in the types of facilities and services that are highlighted in New Visions 2050. This is an increase from what we currently spend to maintain the system. It works out to approximately $530 per person per year. So now I am going to actually pass it over to my colleague, Chrisbauer, who is going to talk about freight planning initiatives at CDTC. Chris, are you able to share your screen?
I'm getting a host disabled participant screen sharing message.
You should
Okay.
be able to share your screen now.
All right. So let's see here. Okay, do you see my presentation now? Great. Okay, so hello everybody, and for those of you who I don't know, Chrisbauer, and one of the things I do at CDTC is manage the freight planning program, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and some of the products we have and some of the tools and resources that are available, and sort of an introductory level presentation, but certainly would be happy to follow up with anyone on the call who would like more information about any of these things. So let's see here. So, you know, why is freight planning important? And the reason is, and I think everybody knows this now, that our regional, our state, and national economies are increasingly dependent on freight being shipped and delivered globally. And you know, as an example, in the CDTC region, and this is based on some 2018 data, so this is not 2020. I'm sure things would be quite different. I'm not sure in what way, but in 2018, this is some third-party data we received from DOT, which is called the Transurge data. There 24.4 million tons of freight were inbound to our region, our four-county CDTC region, valuing at $28 billion within the region. So not to, you know, discount what happens just within our borders, 3.8 million tons, $2.9 billion, and leaving the region, 22.9 million tons, $24.6 billion. So clearly, its importance is measured in the billions of dollars, and you know, that's one of the main reasons why we account for it. And you know, right now we're seeing an example with the distribution of the vaccine of how important our freight distribution network is. And so why does CDTC plan for freight? Well, one of the reasons is because we have to. You know, federally, we're required by federal legislation, including the FAST Act of 2015, to plan for freight and to include it in our planning processes. And in that particular legislation was the first time federally that we had freight-specific funding, both formula funding and discretionary funding. Also in that, in the previous legislation, MAP 21, it required us to start tracking performance measures, including the TTTR measure, truck travel time reliability. So we must take that into account also during our planning activities. In addition, at the state level, New York State DOT last year adopted their state freight plan. And so, you know, we like to make sure that our freight planning documents are current and up to date so that we're able to participate in the development of documents like that state freight plan and make sure that our region's needs are included in, you know, in the process. And locally at CDTC and as, you know, through our New Visions plan, you know, what we really try to do is embrace the contributions that freight makes to our economy and recognize how important that is. And even though, you know, we are part of this global economy, some of the effects and some of the negative impacts can be felt locally. So we try to offer support for minimizing those negative impacts. I wanted to draw your attention to, you know, for those of you on the call who might be newer to freight planning, to this particular resource that was developed through the New York State Association of MPOs, the Freight 101 fact sheet. I'm going to post some links to all of these in the chat pod when I'm done here, so don't worry about trying to write any of this down. Anything I talk about, I'll post a link to in the chat pod. But this is a really great resource if you want to get a basic understanding of freight movement, who the players are, the different types of cargo that move, and how they move, what modes of transportation, and things that you might want to take into consideration if you plan on undertaking freight planning in your jurisdiction. In there, there's also data and resource lists that can point you in the right direction for freight-related data. So the balance of my presentation here is going to be mostly about CDTC's freight planning program, and this is sort of an outline for that. But we're going to talk about our freight advisory committee, our long-range planning documents, and some available tools and resources that we have developed by CDTC and by others. So first is our freight advisory committee, and I know there are at least a couple names on the call or folks who have attended the committee meetings in the past. It's really the cornerstone of our freight program. It is intended to bring together public and private individuals who have some sort of interest in freight or logistics. And for someone like me, it's very educational. Working in the public sector, to learn from the private sector about what's important to their business and how they operate, and that helps us plan better and helps us provide better information to our members. And you can see some of the folks who attend some of our meetings typically, railroads, manufacturers, Port of Albany, airport. It's multimodal, it's open membership, anybody who's interested in that. The major guiding document for our freight program is our regional freight plan, which was developed in 2016, actually 2015 and adopted in 2016. And in there's a lot of information. There is a regional freight profile, which is probably a little bit dated at this point, but talks a lot about which modes of freight, commodities and things like that on the regional basis. There's some educational materials that provide overview of modern freight and goods movement. And again, even in the last 5 years, it probably changed a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. We have some information on land use and some suggestions for regulatory and planning tools, and I'll talk some more about those later. And then trends and forecasts, any data that's available to us. And at the bottom, the thing that everybody was always interested in was recommendations, short and long term. And some of those are traditional transportation projects, but also policy studies and programs. And we've updated those since 2016 as part of the New Visions 2050 process. And Jen had already mentioned our freight white paper. And for our freight white paper, we knew we couldn't reinvent what we did in 2016. That was a major effort that was multi-year and involved a lot of resources. So it was an update of the key components of that plan, including the freight priority network. We added in performance measures because of that new mandate. We updated our project list, recognized projects which are completed, and added any that had come up in the meantime. And we added in a freight and environmental justice analysis, something that was notably missing from the freight plan. So I want to take a moment to talk about our freight priority network. The majority of freight, about 60 to 70% of the freight in our region is moved by truck. That is, in terms of both tons and value. And at CDTC, and the nature of our business is a lot of what we do is highway projects. So, that we can influence that particular realm. And so we have a designated freight priority network with the idea of a highway network to provide efficient and safe truck movement to and from and through our region. And, we encourage local municipalities to consider the locations on this network when they're, thinking about where they might want to, zone industrial or manufacturing or other freight or truck intensive uses. If you go deeper in the plan, you'll see that there are 3 levels of gradations that have different criteria. Major is essentially our interstate network. Minor is sort of the longer corridors that connect many freight facilities. Think Central Avenue or Route 9, something like that. And our connectors are last miles, very important to the supply chain. So those regulatory tools and planning tools are on page 44, 47 of the document. But given some of the audience here, I wanted to maybe dive a little bit deeper into what some of those are. And, these are things that, some of which have been used in our region and some of which have yet to be used in our region. But the first is road use agreements. And these are voluntary. They could be formal and informal agreements. That look at issues such as routing and route maintenance when it comes to trucks. We do have some examples of where we have done this in the city of Albany. Truck routes, this is something that we get a lot of questions about. We really try to encourage a systematic approach to identifying where the appropriate places are for trucks to be or not to be. It's definitely much easier to do before there is a problem versus after, and we have some examples of that as well that we could share with you. But in some places it's done by inclusion. This is where we would like trucks to go. In some places it's done by exclusion. And just like I said before, really urge you to consider the location of our freight priority network and the state's access and qualifying highway network when you're thinking about these truck routes. I will say that, in my time working with different freight interests and trucking entities, that most of them are typically willing to work with people on these issues. They don't want to be the bad guy, typically. I'd say almost all the time. As far as zoning, you can apply freight overlay districts. That's to preserve locations that are good for that type of activity. Of course, light and noise pollution control, special tax districts that might cover any specific needs of a certain industry, and then community benefit agreements, which we don't have any that I know of in our region, but sometimes those are negotiated when there needs to be buy-in from the public and or private sector. But in general, we encourage a proactive versus reactive approach when it comes to planning for freight, because it will become a problem over time. And then for planning tools, some tools that are available is freight-related traffic impact analysis, and to include that as part of the site plan review process or rezoning process, and to consider, not just for distribution center that has 100 bays or something that clearly you think about trucks, but consider with really almost any commercial use, multifamily use, to ask how is freight going to be delivered, and to ask the development community to react to that and to think about that when they're doing their site plan. For very urban areas, there's off-hour delivery programs, more applicable in urban business districts, and RPI, who is one of our partners here in the CDTC region, has piloted some off-hour delivery programs in New York City, and we could direct you to those. Vegetated buffer zones, providing that space, while we typically are encouraging mixed use, sometimes with freight, it makes sense to cluster them or, put them in a group and maybe separate them with something that can protect the neighborhoods, if there are any around there, from any noise or light pollution. And then grade crossing improvements. This is where freight intersects, no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, with safety. And there are many others, but again, it depends on where you are. And of course, always encourage folks to be context sensitive. And in our freight plan on page 47, we kind of outline based on land use, and I realize this is probably way too small to read, but the point is that, it kind of help you think about what solution might be appropriate for the particular issue that you're dealing with. But perhaps an even better tool that's been developed in the meantime, and this again goes back, I wanted to plug something that's a great product that one of our partners at RPI did, which is the initiative Selector for fostering freight system performance, energy efficiency, and freight efficient land use. And I will, again, I'll drop a link here in the chat box when we're done. But this is a free tool that is very easy to use. And essentially, you go in there, you identify your problem, the geographic scope of that problem, and answer a couple other little check boxes, and it gives you ideas of how to consider freight when it comes to land use planning. Slight shifting gears here, but just another product that we offer at CDTC are local freight base maps. This is one that we recently did from the town of East Greenbush. But really, it's it's a GIS exercise to drop all different kinds of freight data onto one map, and just kind of see where things are. And we've had folks use this for their zoning and comprehensive planning processes and other uses too. So there's a lot of things that are happening globally and nationally, and really one of the biggest challenges of freight planning is that the things that are happening a lot of times outside of your boundaries and outside of your realm of decision making are having a major effect on what happens locally. And so this is just kind of a short list of, I guess you might say, things that we are thinking about and keeping tabs on. And I know that Jerry is going to talk a little bit more about some of these too. And these are issues that are mostly national or international issues, but definitely we are feeling locally, especially with trucking, truck parking, and driver shortage, and the new technologies with things changing so quickly, and we see that having a major effect on how freight is moved in the next 5 or 10 years even. And so reacting to that is definitely a challenge. But one thing that I did want to talk a little bit more about, that has kind of really come up, especially during the pandemic, is the e-commerce and new retail economy, which is something that is really having sort of a profound effect on transportation and how goods are moved. And so, I think we all know that there's been an increase in local deliveries. We know that it's accelerated during the pandemic. We're not sure exactly to what extent, but we know that it's a lot. And so while there has sort of been this little bit of nice relaxation to congestion and traffic, some of that has been sort of offset by this increase in local deliveries. And it's very hard to measure for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that freight, for the most part, is moved in the private realm, and so it's private data that we don't have access to. It takes many forms, so it's not just an 18-wheeler going down the road or a UPS truck, or maybe some of the more recognizable forms that are at the top of this particular slide. But now we know that deliveries are being made in personal vehicles. Very hard to figure out, when you're doing a traffic count, which one's a delivery truck, which one's a plumbing truck, which car is just somebody, a passenger car, and which one is delivering goods, or, and then it goes beyond just packages with things like food and other things being delivered. And I saw even this week that Uber is delivering presents for Christmas. So it's a rapidly changing landscape, and something that that we are always trying to keep up on. So that's all I have, and I think we're going to hold questions till the end. Is that right, Jen?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
You can make Jerry the host or me the host, and then I can make Jerry the host.
Okay, let me see here. And my slideshow. All right. And then, so.
Great.
There we go.
Thank you, Chris. And we really appreciate today Gary Bogatz from the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council being able to join us and talk about their experience in the New York metro area with the growth in e-commerce and moving freight around a very complicated and extensive transportation system. So Jerry, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Jen and to Chris and to Mike Francini for inviting me today. Happy to talk in this learning series about some of the trends that we're experiencing in the New York City metropolitan region. And as Jen says, it is complicated, and you'll see in some of the statistics I'm going to provide how large it is. Not necessarily in size, although it is spatially large, but also in terms of the amount of goods moved and the value of those goods. So I want to start with a caveat, which Chris mentioned, and it's something we all have to start with now. That is a COVID caveat, that the trends, forecasts, and metrics that I will be discussing are all pre-COVID. And although freight has probably been impacted less by COVID than other aspects of transportation, it's not like it's not been impacted at all. So when we're talking about the future, as Chris pointed out, some of these trends will be accelerated by COVID, others will not. And there's really a lot of unknowns in the immediate term, medium term, and long-term future based on what we've all been experiencing with the COVID pandemic. We are doing freight planning in a very large, complex, multi-state region. And in this particular map shows NIMTIC is this area here at the core of the region, including 5 boroughs in New York City, 2 suburban Long Island counties, and 3 Hudson Valley counties. But we are joined in a consortium of MPOs and COGs that stretches from eastern Pennsylvania through northern New Jersey to our north in New York State, and then into southwestern Connecticut all the way up through Hartford. This is known as the Metropolitan Area Planning Forum, or MAP Forum, and it's a good approximation of the overall metropolitan region, although the consolidated statistical area is a little bit different. The major parts of what we're dealing with for commuting and for freight are included in this overall region. And as you can imagine, coordinating amongst 4 states and multiple MPOs and COGs is a bit of a challenge. I just want to go through a little bit of context, although, I am going to be talking mainly about the trends that Chris alluded to that we've been watching, but understanding our region does help to define how those trends and key aspects are affecting freight in our region. Tremendous amount of flow here, as you can see, over $1 trillion worth of value and nearly 700,000 tons of freight moving inbound, outbound, and within and internal to this multi-state region, which is referred to here as the MAP region. So huge amounts. What's not shown here are the amounts of freight that are actually moving through this particular region. It is a corridor region at the same time between the Middle Atlantic states and the New England states. So there's an awful lot of goods movement happening, and you can see the relative percentages inbound, outbound, and within and internal. These statistics, by the way, are the same that Chris quoted from the 2018 Transearch database, which is the most recent commodity flow information that's available at this time. By mode, you can see that we have an enormous reliance on trucks, and part of that is due to our topography, part of that is due to the way the infrastructure is laid out in our region, and part of it is due to the reality of how goods move and where they're moving in our region. So you see an enormous amount of truck movement and relatively small percentages of water and certainly rail. I'll explain that a little bit in a minute. And when you're talking about the commodities themselves and how they're moving, you might notice a couple of key things here. First of all, within the region, an awful lot of secondary traffic, which is basically traffic between distribution centers and ultimate destinations. Also, if you're looking at outbound, we're sending out a lot of waste. Actually, the majority of our outbound goods are bads, waste, or scrap materials. And inbound, you can see the characteristics there. So this is just giving a little bit of a picture of what's moving and how it's moving. Some of the key trends that we're watching, which is what Jen and Chris asked me to really focus on. First of all, we anticipate a growth in goods movement, but again, this is pre-COVID. So how this is going to be affected by this pandemic, and it really depends on how long it lasts, and some unforeseen impacts that we're just beginning to define now in terms of how it changes how goods move and how people live, really. That's what it really comes down to. But using the 2018 Transearch database, we forecast a very significant increase in tonnage and in units between 2018 and 2045, and ultimately also in value. 1.6 trillion in 2045 is the value of the goods being moved. So we're looking at significant growth in our region in an already overtaxed transportation system. We're looking very closely at e-commerce. We had some supplemental work done after our current regional transportation plan was adopted, which included a freight element. We looked at e-commerce, and we're projecting very significant increases over time in online share of total retail sales. As you can see there, up to 15% and total online retail sales. The forecast is bringing it up in the neighborhood of 40% of U.S. retail sales by 2040, roughly, that would be e-commerce. Now, this is one of those trends that's probably going to be accelerated by the pandemic because of the over-reliance right now on deliveries, as Chris pointed out. And, the long-term trend is certainly going to be reinforced by what's happening now and may even be accelerated. The effects on the supply chain are a decentralization of distribution facilities and a focus on fast and flexible, which skews towards truck and air. So this adds additional truck VMT to our network as e-commerce grows. And any acceleration from the pandemic certainly adds to that. Related to that is the whole area of less than truckload. So this shipping is the transportation of relatively small freight. And the industry is growing. They're looking at shipment size optimization, but this is mainly replacing truckload shipping, and it's growing. It has a growing role in home delivery. So you can see how this is adding to and exacerbating the increase in truck VMT that we're certain to experience. We have been experiencing. We're certain to continue to experience in the New York City metropolitan region, and most metropolitan regions will also experience this and have been experiencing it already. The effects on the supply chain are smaller shipments with greater frequency and more delivery trucks at peak hours, more terminals closer to customers, and superior driver pool compared to truckload. So the approximate timing of this is linked to e-commerce, obviously. So that trend that I just showed you in e-commerce certainly applies to less than truckload. But you get the picture here of additional demands at the curbside, additional demands on local streets and on arterial roadways as truck deliveries increase in volume. Another trend that we're watching very closely is warehouse design and automation. So this is, again, accelerating due to the movement towards e-commerce. But it is also changing the economics of moving goods, and it is making urban locations more competitive in terms of where distribution centers and warehouses might be located, which does have the effect of actually reducing VMT by a bit, but again, the overall volume is expected to outstrip that. The automation is producing more productive sites, higher freight generation per acre, and also it's feeding large structural trends like the freight generation that's coming out of new locations in our region. That would be Eastern Pennsylvania, which has shown experienced a huge growth in distribution centers, major distribution centers, and in increasing truck volumes from that area crossing northern New Jersey into the NIMTIC portion of the region. This is all because of the acute sensitivity that's grown to delivery speed and reliability. So automation is certainly being explored in response to that sensitivity. And the timing of this is right now. It's happening right now, and certainly in the near term. Some of the key characteristics of our region. Actually, I just wanted to go back and mention one other trend that we're watching that I don't have in these slides, which is distributed manufacturing or 3D printing. Actually, they're sort of overlapping, but there is some distributed manufacturing which is not 3D printing. We don't know where this is going to go ultimately, but it is a growing segment of manufacturing. When you get into decentralized or distributed manufacturing, you're getting into an area where goods are no longer have to be moved in the same way as currently. And it really is hard to predict what percentage of manufacturing will be done through these means in the future. But at one end of the spectrum would be a completely decentralized system where goods are produced in a very decentralized fashion, sometimes in the home, sometimes in locations throughout a region. So that is an important trend to keep in mind for the future. And it's very hard right now to predict how that technology is going to ultimately affect what we're talking about. Quickly, some of the key characteristics of our region that sort of amplify some of the issues that are caused by these trends. First of all, because of our over-reliance on trucks, major freight volumes occur in our highway corridors right now. This map shows actual tonnages on some of the major roadways, 95 and 80. You get a sense here of the corridor movement on 95, 80, and around the Beltway of 87 to 87. And of course, we have the world's largest cul-de-sac called Long Island, which is serviced by 495 and to some extent State Route 27. Huge amounts of goods move in and out of Long Island through those portals and have to move through New York City to get on and off. There's a multiplicity of truck trip purposes based on the complex movements that are happening in our region. As you can see here, there's through trips, terminal and warehouse trips, distribution and interplant, and urban delivery. All of these are adding to volumes, but also creating different patterns of those volumes based on where in the region the movement is happening. So it's putting different demands on different parts of the roadway network. Freight rail is very limited in our region, mainly because there is no way to cross the Hudson River by rail that is south of Selkirk, which is just south of Albany. So that really limits the ability of rail freight to move goods east of Hudson. And that creates a situation where rail freight is moving into northern New Jersey. It's being offloaded in the terminal areas there, and it's being dragged across the river by truck and moved to other parts of the region. So that puts more demands on the those choke points, which are the crossings of the Hudson River and so forth. There are, our region is only the Bronx and the Hudson Valley are on the mainland. The rest of the region, including 8 million people on Long Island, are on islands, and therefore movement has to happen across water to get to those locations, and that creates a number of regional choke points. These freight rail limitations exacerbate those choke points. And because of these freight rail limitations, there's a geographic imbalance of multimodal facilities, which tend to be in northern New Jersey, which is where the action is, and are very limited east of Hudson. So attempts to pull rail across the harbor via a new rail tunnel and so forth, which is still being studied actively, also face the limitations of a lack of multimodal facilities in places like Long Island and New York City and in the Hudson Valley. And then finally, our region features major port facilities, mainly in northern New Jersey, but also Brooklyn Marine Terminal and Howland Hook Marine Terminal in New York City. Certainly the traffic that is produced at these locations exacerbates, particularly in the surrounding roadways, what is already a challenging situation for moving goods through our congested roadways. And so this just adds to the trends that I've already described. So having given you that little bit of an overview, thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you about these trends, and be happy to answer any questions when we get to that point, if I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen. So stop sharing. There we go. Okay.
And Jerry, are you okay? You've made me the host. Okay, so
I don't know how I did that, but I guess I did. So,
um, okay. So thank you, Jerry. So to wrap this up, we wanted to tell you about some existing and upcoming funding opportunities with CDTC. Our Smart Communities program is open. This is a program where we provide funding to support to local communities to look at how technology is integrated into the transportation system. Our Complete Streets workshop program is also still open. We have assistance for ADA transition plans. There is a technical assistance program that we work with the Regional Planning Commission on, the National Highway Freight Program, and we anticipate doing a programming the next tip in 2 short years, about 2022. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty now, talk of stimulus or whatnot. We don't know what's next, but we will, of course, keep everyone updated on that. Chris pasted a lot of these links into the chat box, but these are here for you. And of course, if you have any questions, you can contact me or Chris or Jerry or anyone at CDTC. We'd be happy to help. So in closing, we are wondering if your organization takes freight into account during your planning process, whether you work for a local, state, or other government or public sector organization. Again, this is the live polling, so you can text this or you can open the new browser window and answer the question. We'll give people a couple minutes to respond. And again, if you can't do this through your computer or through texting, you can also put it in the chat. Okay. So the next question is not relevant because nobody chose other. What freight planning topics would more information, training, and or resources provide the most benefit to your organization? And again, if you can't use your browser or cell phone, you can put it in the chat box. We'll give people a couple minutes. In the chat box, we have truck parking best practices and incorporating freight movement into zoning ordinances. Okay, so truck parking is definitely a big topic. No one chose other, so we can skip to that. So now we can take questions if you'd like to use the Q&A or the chat box. Myself, Chrisbauer, Jerry can answer. We also have Mike Franchini, who is the CDTC Executive Director. He may jump in and answer any questions anyone might have. We'll give people a couple of moments if they'd like. One question I have for, it's not a super technical freight question, but I have noticed a lot of the Amazon vans in my neighborhood, and they make some interesting noises when they like back up or when they're doing things. And I didn't know, it was surprising to me that they were, that there are as many. They're not something I recognized before, and I don't know if it's because I wasn't home as much or or if there's just more Amazon vans out in our neighborhood because of COVID and more e-shopping, e-commerce.
That's all new. You weren't missing anything before. There was a facility opened in near Johnstown last year, and then there's the new facility in Skodak, which is operating now. And I've only seen it from the highway, but it's massive. So those trucks are operating out of there. Yeah, so that is all new.
Jen, and I would just add to that it's not only the noise, but it's also, depending on the size of the local streets and so forth and parking regulations, significant addition to local traffic and local congestion with double parked trucks and so forth, or trucks parked in no parking zones. There aren't many loading zones on local streets, so or unloading zones. That's a real increasing issue that we've noticed in our public involvement for our plan, which will be adopted next year. Our next plan, people have noticed and have identified that as an increasing problem.
Are there any examples in New York City or other big metro areas, urban areas that where Amazon is using like smaller vehicles, utility trucks or any of those other kinds of last mile delivery? Are the drones or sidewalk drones, are they in New York yet or not quite?
I haven't seen them in New York City yet, mainly because I think they're concerned that people will steal them probably. But it's interesting because although not necessarily Amazon, first of all, the city is interested in exploring cargo bikes in the densest areas of Manhattan. That pilot program is moving forward to see if there's something there. And there have been instances where, like, for example, FedEx was using specially sized vehicles that were actually battery vehicles. It still is using them. So there has been some experimentation with delivery vehicles that are sized differently and fueled differently, powered differently, and that's positive. But if you look at Fresh Direct, if you look at Amazon, they're moving around in regular old trucks, and that's creating issues.
Yep.
I know that Amazon and Walmart have both made, I think, the largest to date purchases of electric vehicle and electric vehicle chassis for like small trucks and vans. But I don't know if there's a ton of information about where those are being deployed, but all the ones that I have seen in presentations and things like that have been in California.
I'm wondering if they're, mainly relying on their own infrastructure also, or like curbside electric vehicle charging, and where that's available, and if that influences where they deploy those cleaner vehicles.
Well, certainly, range issues are paramount with electric vehicles, particularly for delivery, and the availability of charging infrastructure or fueling, if it's an alternative fuel as opposed to electricity, is a huge consideration. And the city, again, is looking at different ways to manage curb space that may or may not include charging infrastructure at some point, as an incentive for delivery trucks that are electric. But that is all part of the mix of how do you manage curb space in dense areas of New York City.
Okay, so there are no questions or comments in the chat box or the Q&A. So thank you again, Chris, and thank you, Jerry, for taking time out this afternoon to join us on this webinar. For attendees, if you are AICP, this webinar qualifies for 1 CM credit. If you have questions, you can send us an email. That is the best way to reach us these days. But our other information is there. This webinar was recorded, and we will put it on the CATC YouTube channel so that you can help, if you know someone who might be interested in these issues, you can share the link with them, and you can check back at previous New Visions Virtual Learning Series webinars there as well. And of course, you can find us on social media or visit our website. I hope everyone has a good holiday and stay safe, and we will see you again soon. Bye.